I'm Ben Lewis. I'm the VP of Sales at Pontiac Intelligence. And joining me is Erik Thorson, our CTO, and Michael Misiewicz, an independent data scientist consultant who's been helping us on a few projects. What we're going to be talking about is something Matt said earlier, is that cookies are kind of going away. And it already sounds like 40% of browsers already don't use cookies due to Apple. So here at Pontiac Intelligence, we've been coming up with some intelligent ways to handle targeting and audience research in the future. Michael's been working on an interesting project, and they're going to talk with Erik, and they're going to talk a little bit about what that is and its application for you. So I guess a good way to start is maybe Erik or Michael. Why don't we start with you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? I believe you came from biomedical research initially.
Yeah, that's
right?
true. So yeah, my education is in bioinformatics, which is like data science, but for the life sciences. So I had this master's degree where I worked in a very applied situation where I do a bunch of work on a computer, go test in a lab, see what happens, and sort of have a very iterative research process like that. And then for a while I worked at AppNexus, well, a long while, I guess 4 or 5 years. Had a number of jobs there, all data-oriented, empirical kind of oriented work. One of my big responsibilities was working a lot on anti-fraud or invalid traffic, and so a lot of really interesting, challenging problems there. Got subpoenaed by the FBI one time. It was pretty cool. Really neat. And since about 2018, 2019, I've been working independently as a consultant, working on NLP problems, and also continuing with some of the large-scale data mining and information retrieval kind of stuff. That's kind of my background.
NLP is natural language processing?
Oh yeah, that's right. Natural language processing.
We'll get into that later. Yeah. But Erik, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What were you doing prior to AgTech?
I have 3 degrees in architecture, not software architecture, buildings architecture. And doing that for a couple of years, I started getting much more into the generative geometries, super complicated shapes, things like that. So I started getting into writing code for that and utilizing power of singular machines. So writing C++, some of these more complicated languages, and then moving into structural analysis and finite element analysis as far as discretizing meshes, things like that. And then I did that for a couple of years. I worked for a company called Rhino BIM. And then I was at a barbecue, and I was asked by Paul Ruskowski if I'd be interested in getting into ad tech. And I was like, well, this seems interesting. Seems like a very different kind of field. And 10 years later, here I am. So
built in the architecture of Pontiac Intelligence.
Yep.
So Michael, earlier you mentioned NLP. What exactly does that stand for?
Well, it stands for natural language processing. And what it means is kind of hard to define, depends on who you ask and kind of the problem. But basically, there's tons of text in computers these days. Humans write it, it's considered natural language, and there's lots of interesting problems people have, including in ad tech and other industries, about how do you take this text and do something useful with it? That's tons of applications. I mean, that might be something like chatbots, it could be like predicting the next words you're gonna write in Gmail, it could be like detecting whether or not something is like spam or hate speech. Those are all applications of NLP. In the ad tech situation, it's mostly pertinent to content. Assigning things to an IAB taxonomy is a good example. Or targeting based on that. Those are all instances of NLP problems.
So outside of ad tech, what is a practical application of NLP? You mentioned once in the legal space.
Oh yeah, I mean you could do it. You could do all sorts of interesting NLP work on discovery in a legal context. I'm sure there's tons of files that have been recovered in various investigations. Like the Elon Twitter thing. They probably have 10 million emails they got to go through, and the old way of doing that would be you hire paralegals or people who did these unfortunate jobs having to read all this stuff, read the Elon texts, and now you might do a more advanced approach where you would go through with some sort of NLP technique to solve something of interest at a high speed. That's what it's all about at the end of the day.
Got it. So instead of obviously manually reading all this paperwork, you'd have essentially these.
Right, exactly. A very basic NLP algorithm might be. Find all the text where he says, money or something like that, or bots, right? So that's a really basic algorithm, but that's technically NLP. And it gets much more complicated from there, which is cool.
Got it. And instead of just, so is there a way, I guess, how is NLP different than just basic contextual advertising, or how it's I guess. Is it?
Well, the way I'd put it is, I'd say contextual advertising is you want to make some sort of classification about the context of an ad. I think the classic example I've always heard is in the brand safety instance, where if you're an airline, you don't want to put your ad next to an article about an airline crashing, right? So that is context, and so the task at hand is to basically take the text of the article and say, is this about a plane crashing, yes or no? Or maybe you want to say, there's 20 things that I don't want to serve my ad next to. Which of these 20 does this thing most likely belong to? Like that's sort of how you would use NLP in a advertising context and contextually.
So NLP doesn't just understand like the word; it actually understands the meaning of the words in this.
Well, I mean that's kind of the rub there, because for a long time I use that example of like, does the word crash or does the word Twitter appear in this? Using a keyword-based approach is a pretty good place to start. It's surprisingly effective, but it doesn't necessarily have the flexibility of knowing what a word means in context. And over the past couple of years, it's been pretty exciting. There's been some new methods that have been discovered that allow you to understand what a word means in its context a lot better. And this has really opened the floodgates to a lot of new things. And it happens to be pretty well timed, in ad tech with the changing of, cookies sort of going away. It's pretty good timing, because now there's this really good method for doing contextual a lot better at the same time cookies are going away. You don't have to rely on methods like keyword matching or TF-IDF or BM25, all these techniques people used in the mid-2000s. You don't have to use them anymore. There's better ways of doing things now.
So this is, at least in an ad tech context, a kind of a smarter way of doing contextual advertising. So
that's right.
Arguably more effective.
Yeah.
Eric, I guess that is a good question. So how are we incorporating what Michael's been working on in NLP into the Pontiac platform?
Yeah,
specifically from a targeting perspective.
Well, so there's a couple different ways we're doing it. First of all, we're going down two different routes. Maybe you could say three. But the most obvious and straightforward one is by creating site lists, essentially. So typically when you go into a tool that does contextual targeting, you would put in your keywords or your phrase, and it would search through a whole set of different pages to try and find matches for that phrase. In this case, we're using whole websites. So we're getting site lists that best describe a category or a point of interest or something from a client, but something that is very comprehensive of the targeting that they're looking for. So using that, we create a set of exemplar sites, that's a Michael word, and we compare that to all the sites that we've actually served on over the last month. So we're taking all of our own sites that we know for sure have advertising on them and comparing that to these exemplar sites that we're feeding into this thing. So through that, we're able to derive a set of targetable sites that we know actually have ads that have a certain level of matching to them. So we can say that everything above a 60% match, or in this case, a 0.6 or 0.8 score, are acceptable for this targeting campaign. So we'll take those sites out, put them into a site list basically, and use that as our targeting for the next, for the given campaign.
Got it. I think we were talking yesterday. You gave me the example of like a dental hygiene as one of the IB categories, and you had an exemplar site would be about a website about dental health, and then Michael, basically we give that to Michael, who then compares all the like 1 million sites that we served in the previous month, and retrieves the most relevant sites out of all of those to dental hygiene.
Right.
So we've kind of made a smarter version, would you say, of contextual advertising.
Yeah, we're going to have a couple different versions of that. We're going to have the version where we're going to curate sets for you, and we're using the IB categories because they're they're a pretty comprehensive list of, I don't know, it's like 250 different categories that we're going to go through and find sites for that people could just use in their campaigns and actually start to target with those.
And this is something we're going to have featured in Pontiac?
Yeah, you can expect to see in Pontiac and probably definitely by the end of the year, I would say in the next month or two.
All right.
We'll get it in there.
Very cool. And then is there there's the proactive, is there a chance also you mentioned too about clients building their own types of site lists using this technology?
Yeah, definitely. So we're starting with the IB categories, and then we're going into allowing clients to make their own. So if somebody has something, like my wife has a lighting company. So for that, for example, you'd go through and find a bunch of different sites that have articles about lights, things that are very text-rich that you can build a good vector off of to compare against all these other sites that we've served on.
Got it. So you have a one lighting site, and you want to find more sites that are like that site. We'd essentially feed it to Michael's algorithm, which would then return the next 100 sites that are an equal match to that site and also have advertising on it.
Yeah, and to Michael's point with the NLP, it really changes the volume, like, because we can see so many different sites in this case and really find stuff that may be matching but isn't really obvious that it matches.
Something that a contextual crawler would miss, but this vector matching would actually. So is this really just limited to kind of display advertising, or could you say like feed this like a piece of video content, Michael? Yeah.
Oh, that's a great question. I was just thinking about this. So basically, the method we're using here on this problem is, take a text and then find a way to represent it in a manner the computer understands it. Then tell me all the things that are like it. And it happens to be running on web pages, but it doesn't have to. So somebody was here earlier talking about email marketing. So like, let's say you write an email, or writing a blog or whatever. You could think about some content you write which maybe doesn't even have ads on it. It could be a post on social media. It could be a spicy tweet. It could be an email that you see a lot of opens, and you could just put it in as as one part of as input, and you say, well, cool, find all the sites that are like this, and you're going to get some good stuff. So it could mean, for example, a synopsis of a TV show if you wanted to do it in TV. It could be a transcript of a podcast if you wanted to do audio. It could be, or it could be transcript of a TV show if you have the lines. It could be anything that you can write down.
It could be the image recognition of the TV show itself.
Yeah, exactly. We could do it with, there's models that exist these days that will, kind of the opposite of DALL-E, everyone's heard about. Take an image and write a description of it, and boom, now you have text that can go to this pipeline.
That's super cool. And compare it back to these categories, and you can really build out self-describing kind of clips of things like this.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is all kind of possible, and a lot of this is made, a lot of the breakthroughs that have happened in the past couple of years are becoming like, they're building on each other. They're pretty cool, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's been some pretty big shifts in like the semiconductor industry. Like, there's a company that nobody's ever heard of called ASML, which is like the most important company in the world that you've never heard of. And all of this is possible because there's these new processes for designing processors, and they're getting really good at all sorts of things. And it's just a big, sort of a Cambrian explosion, if you want.
So before trying to basically analyze all of this massive amount of text and files would have been a very difficult challenge.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, people have been doing it for a long time, and the only way you could have done it back in the day, the only way to make it work was with keyword. And so, that's all right. I mean, it actually gets further than you'd sort of expect, but it really, when it fails pretty spectacularly because there's so much nuance that even a 3-year-old would get about what a word means right here that, keyword-based systems just can't capture. So there's a new era coming, or we're in the new era.
Very exciting. So there's another tool that you've been working on, Eric, that I think you're going to integrate some of this. This is a kind of audience research. In a world without cookies, like how do we handle audience research and analysis at Pontiac?
Yeah, so this is kind of it's a developing tool, and it's kind of a baby within the company, but it's the idea is that you'd be able to take your audience and you'd be able to derive from, let's say, your audience on your own page, a list of interests that basically describes them. So you could take that, and there was the guy earlier that was talking about the way that he targets using the Nielsen data based on these panels. But this would be more of a observation of the different sites that people from different geos are going to and different audiences are going to. So if you take your own site list or your own users from your own site and you look at their IP addresses and you back into it what sites people visited those IP addresses or those zip codes that those IP addresses are coming from, you can start to build a profile of the type of interests that are popular within those zip codes. And you can start to build you could back into a whole campaign from just looking at these IP addresses and the type of content that these people consume.
So if I get this right, and correct me if I'm wrong, we put a pixel essentially on a brand's website. And then when people go to that website, we capture the IP addresses, which back into zip codes or counties that they're living in. And then using essentially the data that we have through Michael, we understand what people in those counties are essentially the content that they're reading.
Right.
And then perform profiles on, you thought your audience cared about this, actually they care about horticulture and cryptocurrencies specifically in these zip codes. Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's the idea. And we used to be able to do things like this, or we still can do things like this with cookies. And the way that, when you see the volume of bid requests that we see and things like that, you really get a good cross-section of the traffic that exists across the country. With this, we eliminate the cookies. So we're basically offering a cookieless solution that's a potential replacement. We don't know if it's going to compete at exactly the same level, but it's definitely early in its evolution, and there's a lot of potential.
I got it. So what's unique about this is that it doesn't rely on cookies at all.
No, it doesn't.
So it's all based upon where the user is coming from and then what we know about that location. Or what we know about what people visit from that location, essentially.
Right.
Very, very cool. I brought this up to a friend of mine, someone who was speaking earlier, and they agreed that the cookie's going away, but they felt that the IP address may be going away too. Do you have an opinion on whether that's the next axe to drop for Apple or Amazon?
It's possible. Apple's already offering that as a service, a proxy that the web traffic gets routed through. The IP address itself is very fundamental, though, to the whole way that the internet works. So to mask it all, although possible, really gets rid of all targeting altogether for us. So I kind of think it's unlikely. I mean, the whole industry becomes much dumber if that happens, I think.
This is not just a thing like a cookie that could go away. You could have contextual or NLP-based targeting. If the IP went away, you wouldn't be able to do any advertising at all. It would really just be
Well, you would, but you wouldn't be able to really target it. You would be really...
no geo-targeting would be available.
No, even like the geo-targeting solutions that we have now are all based on IP addresses and the ISPs sharing data about where those IP addresses are directing to. And without being able to see the IP address in real time, it becomes very difficult. Or it becomes like a walled garden. Like, if it all goes through a proxy and Apple owns that proxy, they could be the one populating the geo feature in that case. But it all becomes kind of centralized through these proxy servers.
So it sounds like we're planning on using this technology for kind of increase our ability to do audience research without cookies, to give more opportunities for targeting, particularly without cookies. I guess, do you think this will be effective? Do you think this will be more effective than how contextual targeting works today, or more effective than how audience cookie-based targeting works today?
I think it will be. Also, it is newer technology, and we kind of have to see how it works and kind of what's good and bad with it. There are going to be some things where contextual is just not going to be helpful. Like, if you click on a product page and you're doing retargeting with cookies, that's not really something that contextual is going to help a ton with. So that's okay though. What I think one of the really interesting things here is using the new powers of retrieval and discovery with the contextual data that exists now to find patterns you didn't know existed in your data. And for me, that's really exciting. I think one thing, and I think combining with the zip code data is a really cool idea. But one thing that is really interesting to me is somebody earlier in the summit was talking from 3M. Maybe you run some banner ads for, the blue painter's tape, and you find out it's actually, really performing well when you put it on, let's say, you would think painting websites, but actually it turns out it's, I don't know, maybe people making jewelry because they use it in some part of their process for, casting dyes or something. I don't know, just making that up. But the point is, you wouldn't necessarily know that, and you have such a powerful tool to sort of reach into the big giant pool of stuff and yank whatever comes out. And it might actually do dramatically better than the old methods in some scenarios. There really wasn't a way to do that before. So on the one hand, yeah, things are going to change, but on the other hand, new opportunities open up. And I agree with Eric. Getting rid of IP addresses entirely is much harder than cookies. Cookies are fragile technology. You're going to build billions and billions of dollars of business with text files on a computer. Okay. But IP addresses, you do need them to sort of move packets around. So it's a very different proposition.
It's a foundational part of it.
It's more foundational. I mean, it's true. There are ways, there are proxies and things like that. But you're not going to be able to get rid of geo information. That's just not a thing. There's legal requirements to have it around. There's all sorts of reasons. So I think the core concept of let's use geographical data, whether it's derived from IP or HTML5 or whatever, that's not going away. Content is not going away. So there's going to be ways to get things done. And honestly, I think people maybe have gotten a little bit lazy in the past with cookies, and maybe this is overdue.
I think the other interesting thing with the IP addresses and the cookies going away, is that a lot of what we've been talking about today is CTV, and CTV is not cookie-based really. You're not going to retarget somebody on CTV. None of that is part of that conversation. So it becomes much more, as TV has always been, about finding this audience through more traditional kind of things like demographics and income levels and number of kids in the household, and things like this.
And we can, based on where someone's viewing the ad, the IP address or the zip code, we can intuit things like what their demographics are, and now what it is that they read or what their interests are. Is that right? Without ever having to use a cookie.
Right, and a lot of that data is directly available from the government. The census data itself is, a huge survey that they do every 10 years of exactly things like income, number of kids in the household, the time it takes you to travel to work, and literally 1,000 other data points that they put together.
Cool. Well, I guess, if the audience at home is to take away one thing from this conversation, I guess, or one idea, I guess, what do you think it should be?
I think it should be that the cookies going away are offering us a new opportunity. I wouldn't look at it as an end of advertising or a horrible new direction for the industry. There's going to be tech that replaces it, and who's not to say it's going to be much better and more efficient than the tech that existed before.
Love it. Michael, same question.
Oh, I think I'd say, it's time to take another. I mean, I think people maybe in the past were used to keyword algorithms not working well, and it's time to take another look. It's a very different game now, and I think there's huge opportunity out there for people who want to take it, and that's why I got into this project, because I see the opportunity. There's a giant opportunity here. So do it. Use some contextual data from Erik. On me. That's what I say. Yeah, from Pontiac. Yeah. I think that's a big thing.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining today, and thank you for listening at home.